Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 6 lecture for English 1020. Today, this audio lecture begins our second unit of the semester, which is the short fiction unit. So what I want to do today, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the components and characteristics of fiction that I want you to pay attention to. This will feel quite similar to the lecture I gave at the beginning of the poetry unit, where I talked about form and setting, symbol, theme, etc. There were a few additional things I spoke about, but I'll do something quite similar today with short fiction. And I hope what you'll notice is a lot of the skills and a lot of what I asked you to do during the poetry unit, those skills and those techniques will transition or transfer quite nicely to the way I want to talk about fiction, and in particular short fiction. So the point, I suppose, is while there are obvious differences from a formal perspective between poetry and fiction, the way we write about the two, the way we talk about the two, they are quite similar. And what you might find is, even though we've moved formally from one modality to another, we're not necessarily changing or shifting the sorts of ideas that we want to entertain, the sorts of preoccupations that we should have, and the sorts of techniques that we'll use to understand fiction or short fiction. So as a place to begin, perhaps one of the best ways to differentiate or distinguish fiction from poetry is to acknowledge that fiction uses prose and poetry uses verse. But again, there are so many similarities between the two. For example, many of the poems that we read during the poetry unit had distinct narrative elements to them. There were characters, there was character development, perhaps there was even a larger arc within some of the poetry that I asked you to read, which might look, or now that we've transitioned to the fiction unit, it might become clear to you that some of the poetry that I asked you to read, it follows that Freytag 5-part plot structure, where there's this building, or there is this inciting incident, and there's a kind of resolution at the end. So again, while there is, of course, a formal difference between the two, again, short fiction and fiction at large uses prose, poetry uses verse. I want to emphasize this as much as possible. There are so many similarities between the two, but I wanted to start today by thinking about plot, because plot is something worth considering and worth thinking about when conducting an analysis of a novel or a short story, or when just attempting to think deeply about fiction. And when I talk about plot, what I'm ostensibly talking about is the packaging of particular sequences. And connected to this packaging of particular sequences are concerns and considerations such as pace, whether the story happens quickly or slowly. Think, for example, about action movies. The pace in action films is often quite fast. There's a rapid pace. That's part of what's exciting and enjoyable about it. Whereas, by contrast, perhaps a sober drama about two people and the disillusionment of their relationship, that might have, on the whole, a slower pace. It might seem to move not as quickly or not as rapidly as perhaps one of those Avengers movies. And I think we could probably deduce why, or make certain inferences as to why. Some of it's about genre and expectations, some of it's about history and inherited sensibilities. But again, when thinking about plot, we are often thinking about the packaging of sequences, and what that means ultimately is we're thinking about how an author, or if we're thinking about film, how a filmmaker chooses to organize the action of a story. Because, and I'll talk in just a moment about the Freytag 5-part plot, because that's a conventional way to think about plotting. But if you've ever seen, for example, a movie like Pulp Fiction, Quentin Tarantino's film from the 90s, what you'll know about that film is that the packaging, the plot, it is telling a story. There's action, there's consequence, it builds on itself, but the chronology is disjointed. It's a story that's told in a non-chronological way. And the more sensitivity you have to the way stories are packaged, the plot of a story, the better you'll be able to perhaps infer what a writer or a filmmaker wants to do with the larger story under consideration. Because, and I think this is important, I'll talk about this a lot, form informs content. We must think deeply about the form of a text if we want to consider the context itself in any meaningful way. And that's another way of saying that form and content, they have a relationship with one another. They work together. They work with one another in ways that we must account for. We must take the form of a text into consideration if we really want to understand the content of a text. But let's transition back to talk about briefly Freytag's 5-point plot diagram. Now, this is on page 78 in your book, and this conventional way of thinking about plot is something that writers and filmmakers use quite often. If you are, for example, familiar with the romantic comedy genre, films like Notting Hill. I'm aging myself a bit because all of my references are from the 90s, but all romantic comedies follow this. More often than not, I should say that. They follow this simple structure. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. And you can see how often those stories, if you are familiar with them, they don't disrupt chronology. Everything's told in a very strict and predictable chronological way. There aren't, for example, a lot of flashbacks. The writer or filmmaker in question doesn't disrupt the chronology a lot. And as another way of just developing this idea of this 5-part plot pyramid, I wanted to say something about a popular bit of entertainment, Star Wars. If you are familiar with the original Star Wars film from back in the 70s, you probably know that it follows a conventional narrative plot, or George Lucas, the filmmaker, uses and deploys a conventional plot structure. And I thought I would just take a moment and describe it to you. You could argue the exposition before the inciting incident in that film. It's that moment when, and there's a couple of moments, and this is worth saying as well, exposition in a story isn't just one moment. It might be a series of moments. So you could argue that Darth Vader's attack on Leia's ship, the droids arriving on this planet, Tatooine, and meeting Luke Skywalker, our protagonist, all of that is potentially part of the exposition. And the inciting incident isn't really until Luke meets Ben Kenobi, this space wizard, and he learns that his father was a space wizard, and the Empire moments later attack his family, and he agrees with Ben Kenobi to go out into space to have this adventure where they try to save this princess. Now, that moment when Luke perhaps decides to embrace the call, that moment when the Empire attacks his family, that is in many ways the inciting incident of that story, because Luke is our protagonist, and in a conventional narrative, the choices the protagonist makes in many ways helps to move the plot forward. The plot moves with the protagonist, and I'll talk about that word protagonist in just a few moments. But from there, after the inciting incident, there's this rising action that leads to a climax. And again, the rising action, I don't want you to imagine that it's just one thing or just one moment or just one action. It is, in almost every situation, a series of actions. And after Luke agrees to journey to Alderaan, you could imagine that meeting Han Solo and having those space battles, having the Death Star capture them, everything that happens on the Death Star, escaping it, Ben Kenobi's death at the hands of an evil space wizard. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the original Star Wars, but it's like 40 years old at this point. But all of that leads to this moment when the rebels decide to do or to engage in this assault on the Death Star. It's this last-ditch effort to save all of their lives, to save the Resistance, to save the galaxy, etc. And the climax is certainly that battle between the rebels and the Empire when they attack the Death Star. And you could even imagine that the peak of that climax, the moment of greatest tension, the moment, if you are looking, for example, at Freytag's pyramid, that peak or that bit at the top, that's when Luke is actually in, I don't know, whatever that space plane he flies, when he's actually assaulting the Death Star itself, and perhaps the moment when he successfully destroys the Death Star. That's really the peak. And then everything that seems to happen after is really this falling action. So what this should bring to your attention is how a lot of conventional stories, they work with, and they work precisely because they have these moments where everything builds and things percolate within the story to this point where there's a kind of explosion. And what's really interesting about Star Wars is it actually makes that metaphoric or figurative idea quite literal with the explosion and the destruction of the Death Star and everything from there. And this is what's really interesting, this idea of falling action. One of the reasons why the falling action or everything that happens after the climax, one of the reasons why we describe it as a falling action is because, well, after that moment of climax, everything that remains or everything that happens after is a bit deflating because, again, good stories are predicated on conflict and action. And when the conflict dissipates, which is to say disappears, or the protagonist in the story removes the source of conflict, in the Star Wars example, it might be the Death Star itself, well, things from there are not nearly as exciting. And so everything that happens after the destruction of the Death Star, you might notice it's actually not a large part of the film. It's just a couple of minutes. And again, that's because it's not really that important. It's not really that consequential. What really matters is the sense of action, this building that leads to this moment of climax, and then, of course, for us, the audience, the resolution of that climax or the resolution of the action that leads to that climax. So again, I think what you can see, and if you're someone who really likes, I often use film examples because my students often know those in ways that they might not if I made an obscure reference to one of Shakespeare's plays, but a lot of those Marvel movies follow a very similar pattern, or they use and deploy a similar plot. So something I would perhaps even encourage or compel you to do is, if you're someone who likes Marvel movies or you like Star Wars, pick your favorite Marvel film or your favorite Star Wars film, just as an example, and see if you can plot it using this conventional plot structure. Because I think what you might find is that most of your favorite films use or deploy this conventional plot structure. And I use this word conventional a lot, and I don't want you to think that by using that word I'm somehow suggesting that there's something inferior about this plot structure, because I don't think there is. I think some of the best stories use, again, when thinking about form, because form informs content, using or deploying something conventional actually has the effect of creating certain boundaries, creating certain restrictions on what writers and filmmakers can do. And some of the best creative works, whether it's film or novels, short stories, etc., some of the best stories emerge not out of this unbridled freedom to just do whatever you want, but they emerge out of certain predictable, expected patterns, genres, and expectations. So with all of that said, let's transition to point of view. And when thinking about point of view, I suppose we are asking a simple question, which is, who shapes the story? And we talked about this a bit in the poetry unit, the difference between the speaker of a text and the author of a text, and how it is important for all of us to distinguish or differentiate the two. And I would say that's no different in fiction, because in fiction, while we obviously have an author, whomever wrote the story, or if it's a bit of a longer story, the novel, there's always an implied author. There's always someone perhaps in the text shaping the text for us. And that's when we're thinking about point of view, that's what we're ultimately thinking about. Who is shaping the text, perhaps even from within the text? If, for example, it's a first-person narrative or a narrative that uses a first-person point of view. And first-person, quite simply, is just I. So if you are reading a story and the opening line of the opening paragraph reads like this, I was walking down the street and I saw a bagel. That's first person. And I'll say a little bit about the limitations and the benefits of each, because first person, unlike some forms of third person narration, it is quite limited, which is to say there's only so much a first person narrator knows. There's only so much they can see and understand. And again, in that way, I think one of the benefits, of course, is that we feel quite close to and quite intimate with whomever it is that's shaping this story, while at the same time acknowledging that there are certain things we may not know, certain things we may not see, certain things we may not understand, because we as readers understand only what our narrator understands. So from here, the complete opposite, perhaps, of first person is third person. And third person, by contrast, it's perhaps more objective. I'll talk about some of the ways that it's not. And instead of, for example, as you read the opening line to the opening paragraph of a story, instead of I was walking down the street and I saw a bagel, it may sound something like this. She, they, he was walking down the street and he, she, they saw a bagel. So there is, again, this just constitutive distance, which is to say third person narration, it's constituted by a kind of distance. Now, that's not always true, because there are examples of limited third-person narration. If by contrast, and I'll start with the more omniscient picture, because a lot of stories feel this way, where we as the reader have this sense that whomever's narrating this story, they can see anything and everything. They have access to all the characters' thoughts and feelings, wants, desires, fears, etc. That's omniscient. And in those kinds of stories, we as readers trust, perhaps more than we otherwise would, what we're reading on the page, or at least maybe a better way to phrase it is to think we are encouraged. The author or the speaker wants us to believe everything the implied author says, means, etc. But limited third person feels a lot like first person, where perhaps the story, this hypothetical story, and I can give you an example, the Harry Potter book series is an example almost entirely of a story or a series of stories told from a third-person perspective, but it's a limited third-person perspective because we are the narrator, that is to say, sees the world through perhaps Harry's eyes, and Harry's the protagonist of those novels. And that has an interesting effect. Again, it limits or shrinks the size and the scope of the world, but it still maintains some of that distance that most of us come to expect when thinking about third-person narration. Now, the final, perhaps, option or possibility is one that's actually not used that much, but it's quite interesting when it is, and that's second person. So if first is I, if third is he, she, they, second is you. And I suspect you could probably guess or deduce why authors don't use second person that often, and part of it, quite frankly, is because it just feels a bit disruptive. If you are reading a novel or a story and instead of he walked down the street or they walked down the street or even I walked down the street, you felt as though you were the one walking down the street because what you're reading on the page says, hey, you, reader, you're walking down the street, that might have the effect of disrupting the reading experience. I can't think of a single story that I want you to read or that I assigned that uses second person. And even though authors use second person infrequently, when it's used correctly and appropriately, it's actually quite effective and it's quite arresting, which is part of the point because it does the work or has this effect of implicating you, the reader, in the story, which often, especially with first and third person narration, part of the joy or the pleasure for the reader is this distance. And yeah, we often talk about immersion and how wonderful it is to feel immersed in a story. It's immersion, but with distance. And second person almost has the effect of closing that gap, I think is the best way to describe it. So again, pay attention to point of view, because who shapes the story? Who shapes the form of the story is inextricably linked to the actual content itself. Now, something that you might find, and now I want to transition to a conversation about character, because something that you might find that is a bit different between fiction or prose and poetry is this emphasis on character. We often think a lot about characters when we think about our favorite stories. We often defer to the characters in those stories that we like, that we love, that we identify with, those characters whose stories and narratives reflect and mirror our own experiences. And in that way, we and this is, you could argue, the power of storytelling, especially storytelling that uses narrative. if the story in question has a compelling character or a compelling set of characters with stories, fears, hopes, dreams that mirror your own, you feel less alone in the world. It really validates you as a person. So focusing on character is a popular way of thinking about stories, but something that I think matters, especially when thinking about character, is knowing and understanding how to sort and catalog characters. And what I mean by this is often characters in stories fall, broadly speaking, into these binary categories. So we have heroes and then villains. We have protagonists and antagonists, major characters and minor characters, flat characters and round characters. And all of this, and again, I would encourage you not to think of characters as just unmistakably and comfortably fitting into one of these two categories, because what's fun when thinking about characters is to understand perhaps the archetype or the stock character type that certain characters are meant to represent, but then noticing ways they deviate from those expectations. So even thinking about stock characters or archetypes, again, if we return to Star Wars, the naive, idealistic hero is an archetype. It's a stock character that's used often in stories, and that's what we see with a figure like Luke Skywalker, a character like Ben or Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's the old sage wizard, and this is something that we see quite often in stories and storytelling. So again, characters themselves, much like the plot of a story, they have a particular form to them as well. And in many ways, that form, it's inherited form. It's something that's informed by tradition, genre, and particular cultural traditions. And again, just imagining that all of that is so deeply intertwined. Genre is a projection of culture. Culture is a projection in many ways of tradition and traditional values. So characters, and I mentioned, I'll go ahead and just offer a quick definition of these two terms, protagonist and antagonist, because I think it's important. And I would encourage you, and I think this is important, don't mistake protagonist with hero and antagonist with villain, because I think that's often the shorthand we use, but I don't think that's always accurate, because instead, I would encourage you to think of the protagonist as perhaps the main character of a story. And while, yeah, often the protagonist is the hero of the story, I think what I'm talking about here has far more to do with the antagonist of the story. Because again, we often just believe or assume that the antagonist is the villain. But I think a better way and a more informed way to think about this is to imagine that, well, the protagonist wants something. And they will make certain decisions. They will align themselves with certain characters to get that thing they want. And they'll want to get that thing for a particular set of reasons. The antagonist, you could argue, perhaps wants something very similar, but perhaps they want it for fundamentally different reasons. Or they have a completely different orientation to perhaps the thing the protagonist wants. So in that way, again, this is one of the reasons why you often see people identifying with the antagonist of a story, or what they would say is the villain of the story, because perhaps what they're identifying with is not the and this is often what happens, the evil or malevolence that the villain embodies, but perhaps what they find quite interesting is, and what they identify with, is what motivates the antagonist. I think a movie like, I watched this movie just a couple of months ago, a movie like Black Panther is an interesting example of this, because you have these two characters who are frighteningly similar. And one of the reasons why I think so many people identify with the films, again, they would perhaps say villain. I believe his name is Killjoy, perhaps. One of the reasons why they identify with him is because they identify with his perspective and they identify with what motivates him. And this is a reason why I am very, very fussy about distinguishing or differentiating between protagonists and antagonists, or to say it differently, protagonists as heroes and antagonists as villains, because I think that just lacks a kind of precision that I would want all of you to have and bring to an analysis of character. So the final thing I want to talk about with characters is this distinction between flat and round, because when I use language like flat and round, a flat character is perhaps a one-dimensional character, but a round character is a three-dimensional character. And again, I would encourage you, even if as you begin a story, you would define a character as flat, pay attention to the ways that character might evolve, because often these round, three-dimensional, nuanced characters, they emerge out of this flat one-dimensionality. And again, let's be quite clear about something. You will not have, and I would even argue it's not an expectation to have, all of your characters in a story round. You almost need flat characters in the same way that all great stories have major and minor characters. Often those minor characters are those flat characters or those flatter characters, and our major characters are more round. So that's something to think about too. From here, I think I want to transition to talking about setting. So this is where some of the things we spoke about during the poetry unit map quite nicely to how you should perhaps think about setting in the short fiction unit. Obviously, you want to account for the temporal setting of a story, when it happens, if you know any of that at all, and where it happens. So the physical setting. And again, physical settings, that's multifaceted. It's not just thinking about geography, but it's also thinking about, and this is a moment where thinking about symbols certainly intersects with questions of setting. If a story is set at a school, thinking about how schools function symbolically in our society, in our collective imagination. If a story, if it's set in an office, again, that setting really matters because the form the setting takes informs the content. So definitely think about temporal and physical settings, and also think about how much detail the author gives us. Is the setting vague or is it detailed? And why does that matter? Because in some situations, and we spoke about this a bit in the poetry unit, by not disclosing information, an author or a poet attempts to communicate something important about, for example, if it's setting, if a story doesn't have an obvious or distinct temporal setting, perhaps what the author means to imply is there's something omnipresent about all or some of the dynamics at play in this story or this hypothetical story I was describing. So setting, much like it did in the poetry unit, matters in short fiction, or matters in fiction, but for our purposes, short fiction. Now, I won't say a lot about symbol and theme because, again, all of that, everything we talked about in the poetry unit maps quite nicely with how you should think about symbols, figurative language, the use of metaphor, and of course themes in fiction and short fiction. But just quickly, I'll say this. When thinking about symbols, we're certainly thinking about representation or forms of representation. Think about what I said just a moment ago about how schools, yes, they function as literal settings because all of us can go to schools, occupy schools, but schools are more than that. They are symbols. They function symbolically. So take into consideration the different symbols that particular authors deploy. I spoke about Star Wars earlier. Thinking about color and color imagery matters a lot when thinking about symbols. Darth Vader, as you know, he is cloaked in black from head to toe, and symbolically speaking, we associate certain ideas with the color black, especially if it's clothing or if it's something someone may put or place on their body. Even Luke, he's often clothed in white or earth tone colors. That also has a particular effect, at least in the Star Wars film I described earlier. Themes, as we talked about in the poetry unit, themes are ideas, points, or insights that poets, authors, writers, filmmakers attempt to communicate to their reader or audience. And again, themes are often universal, or these sorts of universal ideas or notions. Love, hate. What does a good life or a meaningful life look like? What does it mean to be a mother, a son, a father? Again, family and familial dynamics, cultural and communal dynamics, all of those are often communicated by or part of these larger themes, or perhaps a story may have, although I don't think this is often the case, a single theme. I think most stories have multiple themes at play. While there may be some primary themes, there's almost always secondary and tertiary themes. So pay attention to those ideas, pay attention to themes, the sorts of points and insights that the writers I ask you to read attempt to communicate to you. And again, like so much of what I've said today, the way an author communicates a theme is deeply connected to and intertwined with all of these other aspects of storytelling: point of view, plot, character, setting, symbols, and metaphors. It all does the work. Again, it's all deeply intertwined. Therefore, to conduct sound analysis of fiction or short fiction means in many ways to consider and prioritize all of these different aspects of storytelling. And one final thing, I meant to talk about this when I spoke about character, but I wanted to talk about the ways authors develop characters. Because characterization is certainly something you should think about as you read the stories I ask you to read, but it's also something worth thinking about when you go to write about some of these stories, because there are, broadly speaking, two ways of doing characterization, or two ways of developing characters. There's direct and indirect. And there's a lot of great information in your book, some examples about direct and indirect forms of characterization. I would argue, just as an example, a direct form of characterization is anytime a character says something about themselves. So I want you to envision a situation where a character is at home and perhaps to themselves, which if it's a story, it's also to us, or maybe it's to someone else in the room. They might say something like, I like things to be very neat. Okay, so we learned information about that character, assuming we can trust that character. By their own omission, by the things they say, or by the thing they said, they like things to be neat, which perhaps we can deduce or infer they like their home to be tidy and well organized, not cluttered, etc. That's direct characterization. That doesn't require you, the reader, to do a lot of work to understand this important piece of information about this character. But by contrast, there's indirect characterization, and that might look something like this. So instead of a character saying, I like things neat, I want you to imagine instead they don't say anything. And what the author gives us as readers instead is this maybe 2-paragraph description of this character dutifully walking around their home, straightening certain objects. Perhaps they have a duster in their hand and they're dusting around and nooks and crannies, and that's all the author gives us. Now, I think here, because it's indirect, we as readers need to do a bit of work, because it might be incorrect to assume that, well, they just like things to be neat. Maybe they're doing this because someone they want or mean to impress is about to enter their home. So they're doing perhaps what most of us do, which is they like to tidy things up a little bit before they invite someone into their home. Or perhaps this is just an example or a visual representation of how they prefer to live in a space, how they want their home to look. The point is, with indirect characterization, by contrast with direct characterization, we as the reader must do more work. There are certain inferences we must make that we perhaps don't need to make with direct characterization. So the point, pay attention to how authors choose or elect to develop characters, whether they deploy direct or indirect characterization, and almost always it's a combination of the two. But as readers, we're really looking for those moments of indirect characterization, because those are the moments when we can use some of the analytical tools that I've talked about throughout this semester. So with that said, let's transition to the two extremely short texts I asked you to read, and I want to use them as examples and just to show you how you can work through an analysis of a piece of short fiction using some of the terms that I've discussed in today's lecture. And I think I'll actually start with the Aesop Fable, The Two Crabs. Again, extremely short. You might even think, how could anyone constitute this as short fiction? But fables do certainly count as short fiction. It's not poetry. And because it is so short, I think I'll just read it. This is not something I'll have an opportunity to do in the future, but this is on 429. The Two Crabs. One fine day, two crabs came out from their home to take a stroll on the sand. "Child," said the mother, "you are walking very ungracefully. You should accustom yourself to walking straight forward without twisting from side to side." "Pray, mother," said the young one, "do but set the example yourself, and I will follow. Example is the best precept." So the first thing, if we're thinking about plot, this is quite simple, but despite its simplicity, it does in many ways follow the conventional plot structure I mentioned a moment ago. The bit of exposition is perhaps that single short sentence before the mother speaks, because this establishes setting, it establishes point of view, it also helps to establish our two characters. And you could argue that, again, even though the story is extremely short, the inciting incident and the moment of action is when the mother speaks and criticizes her child for walking incorrectly. This does the work and has the effect of perhaps building a sense of tension, because this moment introduces an obvious conflict. We as readers, if we wanted to pause after that opening paragraph, might ask, well, how will the child respond? What will the child do in response to his mother's criticism? And this moment of climax is actually when the child speaks, when the child, perhaps to our surprise, doesn't throw a temper tantrum, the child isn't compliant, the child is actually, and maybe belligerent is the wrong word, but I think the child's response is something of a surprise. And because the story in effect ends here, this is the apex of the conflict. This is the moment perhaps when at least the story wants us to think, this is the moment when the conflict ends, when all of the action arrives again at this point where something must happen. There's a kind of explosion here. And I think for us as readers, perhaps it's the moment when we laugh at the child's response. And then everything that happens after is really this falling action, because it's this moment where the author reinforces perhaps the main theme of the story. And because of that, because again, this is not necessarily a moment in the story where there's any action happening, because again, the action's ended, it feels a bit deflated. So even though this is an extremely short story, it still follows. You could easily map some of the moments from the Freytag 5-point plot structure onto this short story. Now, from here, if we wanted to think about point of view, the point of view or the implied author or the narrator, it's quite interesting because it feels omniscient. So this is not first person, it's third person. And we know that because we don't see an I anywhere. We see he, she, they, child, mother, these proper nouns. That helps to communicate to us that it's third person. But what's really interesting, and this is what, if you wanted to write about this fable, this is what I would encourage you to think about, the inclusion of that final single sentence at the end, example is the best precept, because I think that almost has the effect of shifting our understanding of who the narrator is. The narrator, while they might seem omniscient, which is to say, while they might seem to see, know, hear everything, they are deeply involved and deeply interested in what we as readers in effect get from this story. And I think in that way, one of the ways or some of the language we might use to describe this narrator, we might say this narrator is extremely didactic, which means this narrator wants to teach us something. This is a narrator who is deeply invested in the idea that we as readers extract a particular message from this story. And I want you to notice how even though this narrator is objective, while this narrator is objective, they're also perhaps deeply invested in their reader knowing a particular thing or extracting something particular from this story. And I think in that way, you could almost imagine using a word like controlling to describe this narrator. And what's interesting about this, when we often think of whether it's people or narrators as objective, omniscient, that almost has the effect of suggesting that perhaps they're not as invested as they would be if they were part of the story. But I think perhaps what we might learn from this, or something we could deduce, is no, this is a narrator who, despite how they may want to fashion, they are deeply involved in this. So even the idea that you could somehow be objective, omniscient, outside of, you're still implicated in the stories you tell. Character is certainly an interesting consideration for this story because, and Aesop's fables do this a lot, where these fables have anthropomorphized animals that can speak, and they really behave like human beings. And so I think the first question we may want to think about is, well, why are they crabs? Why the choice of crabs? And I'll leave it to you to decide what you think Aesop or what you think this fable, what this author means to do by using crabs. But I think by certainly having the two characters as not just friends or casual acquaintances, but having them as a mother and a son is quite interesting. Because I think just immediately we're encouraged to think about the ways mothers and sons interact with one another. And we're encouraged to think about the dynamics between mothers and sons. And I think in some ways, this story both follows or meets our expectations while simultaneously perhaps departing from or even challenging our expectations of what relationships are like between mothers and sons. And I think that challenge is certainly encapsulated in the son's response. Do but set the example yourself, and I will follow you. So again, I don't think it's so uncommon for children to speak to their parents like this, but it is perhaps far wittier than we often assume children are or can be when interacting with their parents. But I would encourage you, again, because I think the story wants you to do this, think about how this story wants you to engage with questions of mother-son dynamics or mother-child dynamics. What about this story confirms some of those established thoughts and ideas about the way mothers and sons interact, and what moments, if any, depart from the way we often or conventionally think about mothers and sons interacting? Now, setting is quite interesting because, again, there doesn't seem to be an obvious temporal setting, which, and I spoke about this earlier, might have the effect of suggesting that there's something quite universal or timeless about what this story dramatizes. And because it's set on a beach, or I think that's what we're meant to assume, because the author implies or the author tells us, thus implying that they're walking on sand, again, which I think has the effect of implying they're on a beach somewhere. You might argue that, well, there's nothing particularly interesting about this setting because it feels just quite natural. Where else would crabs be? But I think that's ultimately the point, is this story, this fable doesn't locate these crabs in a place that feels unnatural. I think part of, and I think this complements perhaps some of the forms of characterization in the story and perhaps even some of the themes of the story, but this feels like a natural environment for them. It doesn't feel like they're anywhere they shouldn't be, which again might just further help us understand the natural or the way or the ways that these two and their interactions, just how natural all of this is. Even though they're crabs, and that might seem quite strange to us, all of this is meant to represent something that perhaps we as readers can understand. So I think setting, even though it perhaps lacks precision, I think all of it works quite naturally with the forms of characterization, the themes that the author wants to develop, etc. Now, regarding symbols, metaphors, figurative devices, and themes, I think you could argue that, again, thinking about how symbols and metaphors connect with character, the fact that in this fable we have a mother and a son. They're both characters, but perhaps they're meant to represent, symbolically speaking, an ideal mother, or the way mothers often are, and perhaps an ideal child in the way children often are, or the way sons often are relative to their mothers. So I think here is an interesting example of how character, symbol, and metaphor can work together. Now, this question of theme, what's really interesting is this story, in effect, gives us the theme at the end. Example is the best precept, but I think there's perhaps more that we could extract from this story than just that. And I've talked about some of it already. I think we could certainly make certain inferences about how authors, narrators, and implied authors work in stories, because a moment ago I talked about the kind of control that this author or this implied narrator attempts to assert over the way we, the reader, interpret this story. But I think, again, you could also imagine that this is a story that's interested in developing an idea about how sons and mothers ultimately interact with one another. So I think that's where I will leave it for now. I know I said I wanted to talk about both of the stories I asked you to read, but because of time constraints, I've spoken about how I don't want these lectures to really go longer than an hour, and I am close to that 1 hour mark. I'll leave it to you to perhaps do the work that I've just illustrated with the Brothers Grimm story, which I would say one thing. Unlike this story, which doesn't seem to fit into a particular genre necessarily, the Brothers Grimm story that I asked you to read at times almost feels like a horror story. And so when approaching that story from an analytical perspective, it's almost worth thinking about the trappings of horror as a genre, because that certainly informs plot, point of view, character, setting, symbol, theme. All of that works together, and again, all of that is certainly informed by the genre, which I would argue at times feels like, and the authors want it to feel distinctly horror, or like something from the horror genre. So with all of that said, I wanted to bring to your attention, there are some excellent reading notes in your book, which might help you acclimate to this fiction or short fiction unit, pages 39 through 41, and page 19 as well. Some of it I've asked you to read, some of it I haven't, but please make sure to do that reading. I think there's an excellent checklist on page 19, which is quite useful, and 39 through 41 offers, I believe, answers to, or examples of answers, if you wanted to do this, to that checklist on page 19. So, okay, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And until we speak again, this is Colin Cox for English 1020.